The archaeologists who developed the concept of peer-polity interaction were primarily focused on understanding how systems evolve and change. However, the same interactions they examined can also help explain how a system maintains its stability once established. This concern tends to align more with the work of historians. After the Eastern Mediterranean system emerged in the 15th century, it managed to endure for an impressive span of 300 years. The key to this longevity lay in the ongoing interactions between states. Any major transformation in one state compelled the others to adapt. Additionally, the members of this system perceived their interconnected world as normal and expected. The ruling classes in each state constructed mental maps that assumed the presence and interaction of neighboring states as a given. These mental frameworks offered a sense of stability, but also served to resist change. New players on the scene were often met with resistance. When Assyria rose to military dominance in the mid-14th century, displacing the Mycenaeans and Babylonians, neighboring states were troubled by the need to adapt. The shift not only bruised their prestige, but it also disrupted their understanding of how power was distributed. For instance, when Bernaburius II of Babylon wrote to his Egyptian counterpart to argue that Assyria was not on equal footing with the established powers, he wasn't just lamenting Babylon's decline. He genuinely struggled to accept Assyria as a legitimate member of the elite circle of great states. Material wealth played a role in reinforcing these mental frameworks. Lavish resources, such as vast quantities of gold, were accessible only to the most powerful. Historians and archaeologists have often concentrated too heavily on material culture, interpreting economic activity as the sole driver behind historical systems. Yet, the endurance of this worldview also existed in the realm of thought. It was an intellectual creation. The states of the Eastern Mediterranean shared intertwined histories and ideological patterns. These shared ideas moved across borders in many forms, not solely through economic trade. Royal correspondence, such as the letter from Queen Pujahipa to Pharaoh Ramesses, helped reinforce a unified perspective of the world. To understand such messages, one must adopt the broader context in which they were written. Travelers, merchants, experts, and gift-bearers upheld these mental maps, ranked in a hierarchy that reflected the prestige of their home countries. They were expected to return with impressions of foreign lands that would bolster their rulers' understanding of the world. Although each participant in the system maintained its own distinct identity and culture, and these differences should not be minimized, they also shared a common cultural and ideological framework. This shared identity was actively preserved as it validated their roles both in the international order and within their own societies. Kings and court officials justified their elevated positions at home by appealing to their standing on the global stage. The scenario I've outlined is by no means unique in the broader context of world history, or even within the specific history of the Eastern Mediterranean. In fact, the concepts of peer-polity interaction and connected histories were initially developed to analyze other regions and time periods. Similar patterns appear frequently throughout history. During the final centuries before the Common Era, the Hellenistic city-states of the Eastern Mediterranean, though technically under the authority of vast empires, continued to function as independent and distinctive entities. Despite their autonomy, these city-states viewed themselves as part of a shared system, bound by common traits that they repeatedly reaffirmed. A comparable structure existed across the entire Mediterranean and into surrounding regions during the 15th and 16th centuries CE, even though it was largely dominated by two rival empires, the Spanish and the Ottoman. Across global history, no state has developed entirely in isolation. Neighboring societies have often shared numerous characteristics. The powerful empires that arose across Eurasia, from Rome in the west to China in the east, during the early centuries CE, did not emerge independently of one another. Their simultaneous rise was part of a broader historical pattern. Similarly, the emergence of the modern nation-state in 18th and 19th century Europe was not just a series of local events, but a continent-wide phenomenon. However, such interconnected systems do not always exist. The history of the Eastern Mediterranean itself provides a clear example of this. After the collapse of the late Bronze Age world and the onset of a new Dark Age around 1000 BCE, the region no longer featured peer polities. Instead, the first millennium BCE saw the rise of a sequence of dominant empires: Assyrian, Babylonian, and Persian. These empires were centered inland, far from the Mediterranean coastline, which came to serve more as a boundary than a connector. For these inland empires, the surrounding territories were seen merely as peripheral zones to be exploited, rather than as equal partners. There was no sense of mutual exchange or shared ideologies. Equality and interaction, which had once characterized the region, gave way to centralized control and domination. While the full discussion of the collapse of the late Bronze Age world is reserved for the next chapter, a few initial observations can be made within the framework of peer polity interaction. This kind of interaction often promotes stability. Those involved typically wish to maintain the system, but it also carries the seeds of its own destruction due to the very nature of the interactions. Much of this interaction is inherently competitive. One of the subtler yet potentially most damaging forms is competitive emulation, the urge to impress and outshine others. The world described here was one dominated by elites. Only a small fraction of society had access to its international dimensions. When royal courts tried to imitate and surpass each other, the cost fell on the general population. Their labor made the displays of wealth and prestige possible. This competition among ruling elites intensified the social and economic disparities within each state. A more overt and violent form of competition, warfare, also had a dual negative effect. Domestically, it diverted men from productive work and placed their lives in danger. On the international level, war conflicted with the shared mental framework that upheld the world system. If states and peoples were organized in a recognized hierarchy, how could one justify waging war against equals? Warfare required a delicate balance, damaging a rival enough to assert influence without destroying the overall equilibrium. During the 300 years of the Late Bronze Age, only one major state vanished: Mitanni. Once the dominant power in northern Syria during the 15th century, by 1300 it had been reduced to a group of client states controlled by Hittites and Assyria. However, Mitanni's collapse didn't dramatically shift the regional balance, as no single power benefited exclusively. The Hittites took control of its western territories, while Assyria inherited the eastern part. Conflicts during this era generally occurred on the periphery of the great powers or took the form of raids that left the larger structure of power mostly intact. Ultimately, both internal tensions and external pressures generated by peer polity interaction played a role in the collapse of the late Bronze Age world. However, these factors alone cannot fully explain what happened. In 1984, the German scholar Alexander de Man published an extensive volume examining the many explanations proposed for the fall of the Roman Empire during the mid-first millennium CE. He categorized roughly 210 different theories under broad causes such as internal political issues, external invasions, socioeconomic pressures, recurring patterns of decline, natural disasters, and religious influences. His work demonstrated how historians had debated these reasons since the 18th century. The lack of a definitive answer has even led some to question whether the fall of the Roman Empire ever truly occurred. In this vein, Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, first published in the 18th century and continuously reprinted since, carried the story forward to 1453, when Byzantium was conquered by the Turks. The fall of Rome has remained a central focus of historical study, never disappearing from scholarly memory. In contrast, the collapse of the Bronze Age civilization in the late 2nd millennium BCE faded from collective awareness. Only in the mid-19th century, when Egyptian records from that era became accessible and comprehensible, did modern historians begin to examine the event in earnest. The similarities between the two periods were quickly recognized, and historians influenced by the German tradition of world history, Weltgeschichte, began to draw comparisons. In his influential Decline of the West, published in 1923, Oswald Spengler readily compared the Sea Peoples and Libyans who attacked Egypt in the 12th century BCE to the Germanic tribes that brought down Rome in the 5th century CE. Since the late 19th century, the year 1200 BCE has often been regarded as a turning point in history, comparable in significance to the fall of the Roman Empire. Historian Fernand Braudel, echoing a commonly held view among general ancient historians, once remarked that in the 12th century BCE, the Eastern Mediterranean returned to a level zero of history, or close to it. While scholars have proposed fewer explanations for the end of the Bronze Age than for the fall of Rome, the body of literature on the topic is still vast. The causes identified tend to fall into the same broad categories. At the same time, the idea that 1200 BCE was not marked by sudden upheaval, but rather by gradual transformation, has become increasingly popular. Emphasizing continuity instead of disruption has emerged as a common scholarly approach in recent decades. The debate is often dense and highly complex, drawing from a wide range of disciplines, including biblical studies, classical scholarship, Egyptology, European and Levantine archaeology, Hittite studies, and more. Scholars frequently expand their focus beyond the Eastern Mediterranean to its surrounding regions, which may have been the source of invading groups or of goods that influence trade dynamics. Specialists entrenched in specific academic traditions sometimes lose sight of the broader historical context and fail to consider how their findings might affect interpretations in other areas of Mediterranean research. In this chapter, I do not aim to resolve all of these complexities or offer conclusive answers. Instead, I will explore some of the major factors related to both change and continuity, while also highlighting the intellectual frameworks that shape various scholarly interpretations. Naturally, my own perspective on what happened, and why, is shaped by my personal biases, which I openly acknowledge. Let us begin by examining a relatively small region that has played a central role in broader discussions about events in the Mediterranean and has sparked significant scholarly debate: Palestine. Situated in the Levant, adjacent to Egypt, this area was deeply embedded in the Eastern Mediterranean world previously described. During the Late Bronze Age, it featured prosperous city-states under Egyptian control. The people there experienced both Egyptian military campaigns and occupation, but they also benefited from the era's cosmopolitan nature. They exported luxury items like wine and crafted goods to Egypt and thrived within a vibrant international cultural environment. Local Canaanite customs existed alongside strong Babylonian and Egyptian influences. In the highland regions lived non-sedentary groups, including the Habaru, feared and disliked, yet often hired as mercenaries to bolster local armies. By the early first millennium, life in this region had changed dramatically. It was now divided among several territorial states, including Israel and Judah. Many of the former cities had been destroyed, while previously uninhabited highland areas were now home to new villages. New populations had settled in the region: Philistines along the coast, and Israelites, Moabites, and others inland. These groups used local alphabets to write their own languages, replacing the older practice of writing Babylonian in cuneiform. They adopted iron tools and weapons instead of bronze, engaged in trade with Phoenicia and Arabia, and displayed numerous other differences from the societies that had lived there 2 to 3 centuries earlier. A dark age separated these two eras, making it especially difficult to trace the exact nature of the transition. Palestine may offer more evidence than any other part of the Eastern Mediterranean for understanding the changes that occur between the second and first millennia. It has also received more detailed scholarly attention. Among its sources is the Hebrew Bible, an influential and vivid ancient text that reflects the perspectives of its authors on these events. The archaeological record is vast. Palestine is one of the most thoroughly excavated areas in the Mediterranean, and perhaps even in the world. Yet the wide range of modern interpretations shows just how challenging it is to use this wealth of material to produce definitive historical accounts. A straightforward reading of the biblical narrative might seem to provide clear answers. According to this account, The 12 tribes of Israel, having fled Egypt during the reign of an unnamed pharaoh who oppressed them, wandered in the desert for 40 years before entering Palestine from the east through military conquest. They are said to have destroyed major cities like Jericho and Ai. After a time living as separate tribes and relying on various male and female leaders chosen during periods of crisis, the Judges, a kingdom eventually emerged under a stable dynastic rule. This united monarchy later divided into two kingdoms, Israel and Judah, which coexisted alongside other political entities such as the Philistine city-states, Damascus, Moab, Ammon, and others. The independence of these states was ultimately brought to an end by the Assyrian and Babylonian empires between the 8th and 6th centuries BCE. In this version of events, the Israelite conquest of Canaan was the driving force of change, introducing a new population and way of life, ending older urban traditions, and settling areas that had previously been uninhabited. Initially, archaeology appeared to support this biblical story. Some cities, including Jericho, revealed layers of destruction that could have been caused by invading Israelites. However, further study revealed chronological discrepancies. Both Jericho and Ai were already uninhabited by the early 12th century BCE, the supposed time of the Israelite arrival. In addition, closer examination of the biblical texts exposed inconsistencies within the conquest narratives and other parts of the account, leading to increased skepticism about using the Bible as a purely historical source. Today, scholarly opinion spans a wide spectrum, from those who accept the biblical account as historical truth to those who reject nearly all of it except for a few details corroborated by external sources. For scholars who do not view the Bible as a historically accurate record, alternative explanations have been necessary to understand the changes that took place in ancient Palestine. One influential theory emerged in the United States during the 1960s, shaped by the civil rights movement and its focus on social justice. According to this view, the collapse of the late Bronze Age city-state system was not caused by nomadic invaders from outside, since large-scale nomadism did not yet exist. Instead, the theory proposes that local, marginalized populations rose up against their urban rulers in what was essentially a peasant revolt. While still drawing loosely on the biblical tradition, this interpretation linked the early Hebrews to the Hebrew groups previously discussed, arguing that internal social upheaval, rather than foreign conquest, transformed the region. For many scholars, archaeology became the primary source of evidence. Some researchers focused on migrations of groups other than the Israelites as the main cause of the decline of late Bronze Age civilization. Among these new populations, the Philistines stood out as key players in the region's history during the early first millennium. They established major urban centers along the southern coast, and archaeological findings revealed cultural links between the Philistines and the Mycenaean world. The pottery they produced or imported closely resembled a type known as Mycenaean 3C, 1B, where particularly the versions made in Cyprus and southern Anatolia rather than in the Aegean heartland. The Philistines were immigrants, though their arrival appears to have occurred gradually rather than all at once. Egyptian records, which will be explored in more detail later, identified the Philistines as part of the Sea Peoples, a collective whose migrations are considered by many scholars to have played a critical role in the collapse of the Bronze Age. Other groups within the Sea Peoples also settled in Palestine. The Jeker, for example, are said to have occupied the harbor city of Dor, as mentioned in the Egyptian story of Wenamun, while archaeological and textual evidence suggests that unidentified groups settled in the central Jordan Valley. However, in more recent scholarship, the emphasis has shifted from abrupt change to gradual continuity. The archaeological record in Palestine reveals a diverse picture of what happened to cities and settlements during this transitional period. Some cities were abandoned, others underwent changes in how people lived, and still others maintained older traditions. The transformation was neither uniform nor simple. Rather, it was a slow and complex process that varied widely across the region. Instead of being entirely reshaped by the arrival of new populations and customs, such as the Israelites, Judeans Philistines, and other sea peoples. Many of the existing Canaanite communities survived and continued their way of life in several areas. Some scholars argue that there was no true Dark Age at all, but rather a new era that emerged from the foundations of Canaanite culture. Megiddo, for example, though destroyed at the end of the Late Bronze Age, was soon rebuilt following the same layout as its earlier incarnation. Bronze Age traditions proved remarkably durable. One theory suggests that the cultural legacy of the second millennium remained influential even into the 8th and 7th centuries, when the kingdoms of Israel and Judah were prominent in the historical record of Palestine. The Israelite kingdom continued many older practices. It remained urban, maintained diplomatic ties with neighboring states, and retained strong elements of Canaanite tradition within its population. In contrast, the southern kingdom of Judah showed more signs of change. It was less urbanized, and its people had deeper roots in pastoral nomadic traditions. Judah's unity was shaped more by a shared ethnic identity, leading to a more homogeneous population than in Israel. The same uncertainties that complicate the interpretation of events in Palestine reappear when examining the broader transformation of the Eastern Mediterranean world. Ancient written sources are often unreliable. Archaeological evidence can support both sudden change and long-term continuity, and a number of peoples and variables involved makes it difficult to reach firm conclusions. Interpretations of both specific details and the overall picture continue to evolve. Archaeology, in particular, remains subject to constant revision, as new discoveries are made and older findings are reanalyzed, frequently overturning what were once considered established facts. A single example from archaeology illustrates this issue clearly: the case of Hattusa, the well-excavated capital of the Hittite Empire. The remains initially appeared to show that the city's centers of authority had been deliberately attacked. The royal citadel, parts of the defensive walls, and various temples were all burned, and the presence of tablets and inscribed ceilings pointed to the destruction occurring during the reign of Suppiluliuma II, the last known Hittite king. Since only public buildings were destroyed, scholars concluded that the attack had targeted the elite rather than the general population, supporting both theories of foreign invasion and internal revolt. However, more recently, Jürgen Seeher, the former director of excavations at Hattusa, reevaluated the archaeological evidence and challenged what had once seemed a clear-cut case. He argued that the destruction of buildings did not happen all at once, and, more importantly, that the structures had already been abandoned by the time they were burned. The buildings were empty, furniture, tools, and equipment had all been removed. Only large storage vessels built into the ground and discarded tablets and ceilings remained. According to Seeher, these signs suggest that King Suppiluliuma II and his followers had evacuated the city with their portable belongings, likely using carts, before any attackers arrived. While ancient people may have altered written records more than the physical remains they left behind, archaeological interpretation is still deeply influenced by modern perspectives. Burned layers of destruction once seemed to confirm a narrative of catastrophic collapse for the Hittite Empire. But newer interpretations, such as Seer's, align more closely with the increasingly accepted idea of gradual change and continuity rather than sudden catastrophe. In the following pages, I will explore several major theories proposed to explain the end of the Late Bronze Age, along with the challenges and shortcomings of each. When scholars first began questioning what brought the Late Bronze Age to an end, they quickly turned to ancient texts for answers. As with the case of Palestine, these sources frequently pointed to military invasions as the primary cause of disruption. Both contemporary records and later accounts depict this image of sudden upheaval. Among ancient civilizations, only the Egyptians left us first-hand written account from the period around the collapse. Around 1200 BCE, two Egyptian kings described military confrontations with invading groups, now collectively known as the Sea Peoples. In the 5th year of his reign, King Merneptah, who ruled from 1213 to 1204 BCE, claimed he had successfully repelled an attack led by a Libyan chieftain named Mary, who was allied with several other groups: the Meshwesh from the west, and the Shardana, Lukka, Eqesh, Teresh, and Shikalesh from the north. As expected in royal inscriptions, Merneptah portrayed the event as a great victory, boasting of captured enemies and seized spoils. Roughly 25 years later, Ramesses III, who ruled from 1187 to 1156 BCE, also reported a series of attacks. In the 5th year of his reign, he turned back another Libyan assault, and again in year 11. Between these events, he engaged in warfare with northern enemies and provided a more detailed account of their actions. Referring to events around 1180 BCE, Ramesses described a vast and destructive invasion. Foreign lands conspired in their islands. Suddenly, these regions were uprooted and scattered in conflict. No nation could withstand their weapons. From Hutti, Kode, Carchemish, Arzawa, and Alashia onward, all were cut down at once. They set up camp in Amuru, devastated its people, and made the land appear as if it had never existed. Advancing toward Egypt, they came full of confidence, saying, "Our plans will succeed." Their alliance included the Peleset, Tcheker, Shikalesh, Dinyan, and Weshish, united peoples who extended their hands over vast lands. Ramesses III confronted these invaders in Palestine, fighting battles both on land and at sea. His inscriptions not only recount the Egyptian victories, but are also accompanied by elaborate visual depictions of the battles, showing enemy warriors wearing distinctive armor and wielding unique weapons. Taking these Egyptian records at face value leads to a picture of repeated invasions by Libyan and sea peoples around 1200 BCE. These attackers were portrayed as foreigners who traveled with their families, wagons, and livestock. Since the early 19th century, historians have attempted to pinpoint the origins of these groups, a pursuit that began with Champollion, the first to decipher Egyptian hieroglyphs. Egyptian texts mention the destruction of several important regions before the sea peoples assembled in Amuru and launched their campaign against Egypt. These include Hutti, Kode, likely Tarhuntassa, Arzawa, Carchemish, and Alashia, modern-day Cyprus, regions spanning central and southern Anatolia. Based on this information, scholars have most commonly proposed that the sea peoples came from the northern Mediterranean. Efforts to trace their roots have focused on that area, often relying on similarities between the names of the sea peoples and known places. For example, the Lukka are commonly associated with Lycia in western Anatolia due to the resemblance in names. Earlier Hittite records even described the Lycians as raiders, aligning with the general portrayal of the sea peoples. The Teresh are sometimes linked to Etruria, based on the Greek name for its inhabitants, Tersonoi. Similarly, the Shikalesh have been connected to Sicily, the land of the Sicels, and other identifications follow a similar linguistic pattern. One of the key challenges in understanding the sea peoples is that we don't know whether they originated from the regions with which they're associated, or if they merely settled there after their movements. In many historical reconstructions, it appears as though people from across the Mediterranean took part in the attacks on Egypt, then dispersed in various directions following their failed invasion. Some scholars have gone to great lengths to resolve inconsistencies in their proposed identifications. For instance, the Eqesh have been linked to the Achaean Greeks based on the similarity of names. However, these people were said to be circumcised, a practice traditionally considered Semitic. One scholar, attempting to explain this contradiction, proposed that the Indo-Europeans originally practiced circumcision but later abandoned it sometime after the Sea Peoples movement. Upon closer examination, many other identifications prove just as questionable. Another major issue is that some of the Sea Peoples mentioned in Egyptian texts were already present in the region long before Merneptah's reign. During the Battle of Kadesh, for example, the Dardana, Lukka, and Shardana were already serving as mercenaries in both the Hittite and Egyptian forces, suggesting they had been integrated into established state systems. This casts serious doubt on Ramesses III's dramatic depiction of sudden and unexpected invasions. Greek traditions, though written centuries later, also attribute the fall of Mycenaean civilization to invasions from the north. Writers from Homer to Pausanias described the Dorians as the agents of destruction who toppled Mycenaean centers or displaced local populations. Other myths involving migrations and the return of Trojan War heroes further reinforce the notion that large-scale movements of people were behind the upheavals at the end of the second millennium. Some scholars try to piece together an elaborate pattern of migrations covering the entire Aegean world by relying on these stories. But given the fragmented and contradictory nature of these sources, most now see that effort as futile and have largely abandoned it. Despite these complications, historians have found additional evidence to support the broader theory that invasions contributed to the collapse of the long-standing Eastern Mediterranean system. Numerous less celebrated sources help strengthen this perspective. Archaeology reveals that several key cities in the western part of the region, including Mycenae, Hattusa, Ugarit, and Megiddo, were destroyed and abandoned around 1200 BCE. At Ugarit, a series of letters discovered in the ruins provide insight into the city's final days under threat. In one letter, the king of Ugarit sent a plea to the king of Alatia, written in the formal diplomatic language of the time. To the king of Alatia, my father, from the king of Ugarit, your son, I bow on my father's feet. May all be well with you, your household, your wives, your soldiers, and everything that belongs to you. Father, enemy ships have arrived. They have burned my villages and brought devastation to the land. Do you not know that all my troops are in Hutti and all my ships are in Lucca? They have not yet reached me, and my land is left defenseless. You must be informed. 7 ships have already come and caused great destruction. If more enemy ships appear, please notify me in any way you can, so that I may prepare. This letter captures the desperation and isolation faced by a kingdom under attack and adds to the broader narrative of turmoil and collapse across the region during this era. Possibly in response to the previous plea, a senior official from Alatia sent the following message. This is what Eshwara, chief administrator of Alatia, says. Tell the king of Ugarit, may all be well with you and your land. Regarding the attacks, these actions were carried out by people from your own country, using your own ships. The surprise assault came from within your territory. So please do not blame me. Now, the 20 enemy ships that had previously stayed in the mountains have left. They departed suddenly, and we don't know where they went. I write to inform you so that you can take precautions. Be alert. Additionally, the Hittite viceroy stationed at Carchemish also wrote to the king of Ugarit. This is what the king says. Tell Amurapi, the king of Ugarit, may you be safe, and may the gods protect you. Regarding your previous message, enemy ships have been sighted at sea. If this report is true, you must prepare your defenses. Where are your troops and chariots? Are they not with you? If not, who will protect you from the enemy? Fortify your cities, bring your troops and chariots inside. Stay alert, and strengthen your defenses. These messages clearly suggest serious unrest, possibly in the final days of Ugarit, a city that archaeological evidence confirms was eventually destroyed. When these letters were first made public, the excavator, Claude Schaefer, claimed they had been discovered in a palace courtyard oven, along with other clay tablets awaiting firing. He believed a wall had collapsed on top of the oven during the palace's destruction by the Sea Peoples, interrupting the firing process. To him and many others, this provided dramatic proof of how suddenly the Sea People struck. This interpretation captured the imagination of historians, despite the oddity that many of the tablets contained only routine administrative information, such as village lists. That detail was often overlooked amid the broader narrative of Ugarit's downfall. However, recent archaeological analysis has overturned the original story of the tablet kiln. Evidence now shows that there was no oven at that location. Instead, the tablets were likely placed in a deposit during the construction of a small wall. This means the letters may have been written well before Ugarit's fall, and possibly at different points in time. The earlier assumption that the Sea People's attack was so sudden the king couldn't even send out his messages was shaped more by prevailing historical theories than hard evidence. Now, without a secure dating context, These letters can no longer be cited as proof that Ugarit fell in a rapid and unexpected assault by the Sea Peoples. Just as in the case of Palestine, a closer examination of the evidence for violent invasions reveals inconsistencies and contradictions. The Egyptian portrayal of a sudden, coordinated onslaught loses credibility when we consider that two pharaohs, living decades apart, recounted almost identical stories involving familiar groups. Similarly, the much later Greek traditions of mass migrations are so muddled and conflicting that they offer little historical value. The letters from Ugarit might shed light on the city's final days, but their significance remains uncertain. They refer only to small fleets, 7 or 20 ships, not to a large-scale offensive that could account for the widespread destruction archaeologists have uncovered. Moreover, archaeological evidence of destruction across the eastern Mediterranean does not point to a single catastrophic wave of attacks. The timeline spans several decades, making a sudden collapse unlikely. In many cases, cities appear to have anticipated conflict long before it struck. Mycenae, for instance, underwent multiple fortification efforts before its downfall, and the Hittite court had time to evacuate the capital along with valuable belongings. Many key cities, in fact, were never destroyed at all. Invasions as explanations for major historical change were especially popular from the late 19th century into the first half of the 20th. Even Oswald Spengler grew weary of this line of reasoning. He once remarked that people would rather claim the Semites came from Scandinavia and the Aryans from Canaan than give up the idea of an original homeland. This belief aligned well with the narratives of European colonial expansion at the time. Just as the Sea Peoples and other invaders were thought to revitalize stagnant societies, colonial powers claimed their presence would bring progress to the territories they occupied. The notion that some of these invaders were Indo-European also appealed to certain ideological movements. Before it was understood that Linear B represented an Indo-European language, the Nazis idealized the Dorians as tall, blonde conquerors who brought civilization to Greece. French scholars, the first to study Egyptian references to the Sea Peoples, framed them as nations in search of living space. But by the 1930s, when German ideas about territorial expansion became controversial, the image of the Sea Peoples began to shift. They were now seen as impoverished, unruly bands threatening a sophisticated civilization. Today, the prevailing view is different. We generally reject the glorification of conquest and prefer to believe that societies should shape their own futures and progress organically. While the Sea Peoples and other raiders undoubtedly existed and caused disruption, they are no longer viewed as the decisive force behind the end of the Late Bronze Age. For a time, some archaeologists supported the idea that earthquakes were responsible for the destruction of various sites in the Aegean, such as Troy, Mycenae, Knossos, Tiryns, and Medea, as well as the city of Ugarit in the Levant. These quakes, they argued, triggered fires that devastated these cities and led to their collapse. While seismic activity is indeed common in the region, it's doubtful that earthquakes alone would have caused such widespread devastation, especially since fires on such a scale are more typical of modern settings involving gas infrastructure. Even if a few cities did fall because of earthquakes and the resulting fires, that alone wouldn't explain the collapse of the entire Bronze Age world. A more widely accepted theory today suggests that around 1200 BCE, the climate in the eastern Mediterranean turned drier. Areas dependent on rainfall for agriculture likely experienced reduced harvests and even famine. Scientific evidence from tree ring data and other environmental analyses appears to support this idea. There's also historical support. One Egyptian account claims that King Merneptah sent grain to Hutti, and texts from Ugarit mention grain shipments headed there as well. Still, the evidence is limited, and there are practical concerns. For instance, how could grain delivered to a port in southern Anatolia realistically alleviate famine in the Hittite capital, which was located over 400 kilometers inland? It's likely that much of the shipment would have been consumed during the journey by the people and animals transporting it. While agricultural difficulties might have contributed to the crisis around 1200, they alone couldn't have caused the entire system to collapse. Droughts had surely occurred before, and people must have developed strategies to cope with them. It's no surprise that climate change has become a popular explanation in historical interpretation today. After all, global warming is one of the most pressing concerns of our own time. Many researchers argue that one of the key distinctions between the Late Bronze Age and the Iron Age lies in social organization. During the Bronze Age, power was concentrated in the hands of palace elites, whose authority extended across nearly all aspects of life. These elites demanded significant contributions from the broader population, whose labor and production sustained their opulent lifestyles. Palaces tightly controlled activities like craft production, especially bronze work, which relied on imported raw materials organized through elite networks. They also maintained a monopoly over written communication. Writing was the domain of highly trained scribes who not only had to master complex syllabic cuneiform scripts, but also learned foreign languages like Babylonian, in addition to their native tongues and writing systems. In contrast, during the early Iron Age, palace power had largely faded, particularly in the western parts of the eastern Mediterranean. In regions such as the Aegean, the Levant, and Anatolia, iron rapidly replaced bronze as the primary metal. Unlike bronze, iron ore could be sourced locally, and mobile blacksmiths could produce the necessary tools and weapons without needing the support of centralized palatial systems. Writing also became more accessible during this time. The alphabet spread widely, and while it was not inherently more effective as a communication tool than cuneiform or hieroglyphics, it was far easier to learn and less restricted in its use. The Greek world of the first millennium BCE, for instance, came to be seen as the birthplace of democracy, with broader political participation. While the level of actual democracy is often debated, it's clear that classical Greece lacked the all-encompassing palatial structures of the earlier Bronze Age. The idea that social factors played a key role in the collapse of the late Bronze Age gained traction, especially in the 1960s. As noted earlier, the theory portraying the Israelite conquest of Palestine as a peasant uprising coincided with the height of the civil rights movement in the United States. Meanwhile, in Europe, Marxist scholars, most notably the influential prehistorian V. Gordon Childe, emphasized social dynamics in their interpretations of history. Although Marxist frameworks are less dominant now than in the mid-20th century, they still persist. If class struggle is indeed a driving force in history, then internal social unrest could well have played a central role in ending the Bronze Age. Reconstructing the economic conditions of the broader population is difficult, but in some regions, particularly in the Syro-Palestinian area, it appears that a small number of farmers supported a disproportionately large number of urban elites. At Ugarit, for instance, estimates suggest that a rural population of around 31,000 to 33,000 sustained an urban group of about 6,000 to 8,000. While these numbers are not exact, they strongly imply that a relatively small working population was responsible for generating the wealth that enabled the elite to live so lavishly. Evidence from across Syria shows that manual labor was in short supply. Landowners, including the king, often struggled to secure enough workers. In response, creditors would sometimes demand that debtors offer a family member as labor in place of interest payments. Private debt was a persistent issue in ancient Near Eastern societies. Although rulers in the early second millennium occasionally issued debt remissions to relieve this burden, such practices had fallen out of use by the later part of the millennium. For indebted farmers, options were limited. Immigration was rarely feasible, as most international treaties, including one between Ramesses II and Hattusili III, required that refugees be returned to their home countries. The emphasis placed on such clauses suggests this was a widespread and serious issue. One treaty from the 15th century, between an unnamed Hittite king and Patatisu, ruler of Kizzuwatna, even addressed the possibility of entire villages attempting to flee. A clause stated, "If the people of a settlement belonging to the great king, along with their women, possessions, and livestock, flee to the land of Kizzuwatna, Patatisu shall seize them and return them to the great king. Likewise, if people from a settlement under Patatisu flee to the land of Hutti, the great king shall seize them and return them to Patatisu. For indebted farming families, the only real option besides submitting to their burdens was to sever ties with their communities and join groups like the Habaru, social outcasts living outside the control of established states. When people deserted their land, the strain on those who remained naturally grew heavier. At the same time, members of the elite contributed to the erosion of their own authority by treating their privileges as entitlements rather than as rewards for duties they were expected to perform. Military professionals, such as the Mycenaean charioteers, for example, no longer earned their status through active service in warfare. Instead, their titles and benefits were simply inherited from father to son. Positions that once required skill and effort became ceremonial roles, with office holders neglecting their responsibilities and weakening the state from within. How many rulers were truly able to resist the demands of the most powerful families in their realms? More often than not, they gave in, distributing favors and receiving little in return. Admittedly, it is difficult to demonstrate a steady rise in social unrest over time, or to pinpoint a moment of internal crisis around 1200 BCE. The treaty with Patatisu already shows that early in the late Bronze Age, farmers were trying to flee their conditions. Still, much of the evidence from the later part of the period can be interpreted as signs of growing internal strain. For instance, the strikes by Egyptian tomb workers during the final years of Ramesses III's reign, after the supposed attacks by the Sea Peoples, highlight how a failure by the palace to supply provisions led to unrest, even among skilled laborers. The letter from Alashia's high official previously mentioned accused Ugarit's own people of being behind violent acts, suggesting internal discord. The repeated fortification of Mycenaean citadels shortly before 1200 may have been intended as protection not against foreign invaders, but against unrest among local populations. Similarly, the royal court's departure from Hattusa before the city's destruction could point to fear of rebellion, and the targeted burning of public buildings might reflect popular resentment toward former rulers. While much of this remains speculative, it is reasonable to conclude that although social tensions were not the only factor behind the collapse of the late Bronze Age, they played a significant role in its unraveling. A reader exploring the collection of academic essays from the 1990 conference titled The Crisis Years, the 12th century BC, might come away with the impression that no true crisis occurred during that time. Several contributors emphasize the extent to which late Bronze Age practices persisted beyond its traditional endpoint. Many centers remained intact, and some regions were only lightly affected by the disruptions that, while acknowledged by all, were not uniformly experienced across the Eastern Mediterranean. While Aegean centers may have collapsed, Cyprus actually entered a phase of notable prosperity during the 12th century. Ugarit may have been destroyed and permanently abandoned, yet its nearby satellite, Ras Ibn Hani, saw reoccupation soon after. Numerous coastal ports along the Levant escaped damage entirely. In Palestine, the transformation was gradual, and archaeological sites from the area show considerable variation. Signs of continuity are evident in inland Syria, Babylonia, and Egypt. From this perspective, the early Iron Age was not a dark age at all, but rather the beginning of a new era built on the foundations of Canaanite civilization. In the past decade and a half, many scholars have increasingly argued that Bronze Age culture was not obliterated and replaced, but instead served as the foundation for much of what followed in the early first millennium. This idea is not entirely new. Already in the 1930s, the Greek historian Martin Nielsen proposed that Greek mythology had its roots in the Mycenaean world. What is different now is that this emphasis on continuity has become central to modern academic discussions. A 2000 conference session, for instance, carried the title The Dark Age That Never Was, highlighting a growing consensus that the early Iron Age in the Eastern Mediterranean should not be viewed as a time of collapse, but as a period of transition marked by social, economic, and political reorganization. Today's scholarship tends to minimize the image of catastrophe at the end of the Bronze Age, instead drawing connections to later developments. This leads us back to the dilemma once posed by Gibbon. How do we determine where one historical period truly ends? It is increasingly clear that many features once believed lost with the fall of the Bronze Age in fact endured well into the following centuries. The Hittite state offers a compelling example in political terms. 2 decades ago, it was widely accepted that the destruction of Hattusa marked a definitive end. The royal line had died out, and the Hittite Empire, one of the great powers of the late Bronze Age, had vanished completely. The populations that later occupied Anatolia, such as the Phrygians, were seen as unrelated newcomers with different cultural traditions. However, both new discoveries and a fresh analysis of earlier inscriptions from cities in southern Anatolia and northern Syria have revealed that the royal line of Hutti continued in that region. Well into the 10th century, rulers there retained the second millennium title of Great King and may have governed significant territories until the rise of the Aramean states altered the political landscape. Numerous other examples could be cited across various aspects of life, political, economic, religious, cultural, and social, that support the view of continuity. Today, few would still echo Braudle's assertion that the Eastern Mediterranean effectively reset to year zero around 1200. Yet this current emphasis on continuity is not without its own modern academic leanings. Across the field of history, there is now a strong preference for explaining change through internal developments rather than through external forces or the arrival of outsiders. Theories of invasion have largely fallen out of favor, while local histories and regional specificities are now more widely embraced. Scholars increasingly highlight the unique circumstances of each case they study. Additionally, many resist the idea of abrupt, revolutionary shifts. From this perspective, major transformations are often reinterpreted as sudden but still organic adjustments within pre-existing frameworks, thus reinforcing the idea of continuity. Still, despite the undeniable connections between the Bronze and Iron Ages, it would be a mistake to go too far in the opposite direction and dismiss the end of the Late Bronze Age as nothing more than a minor disturbance in the region's long historical evolution. In my view, there was indeed a significant break, and the most critical development was the collapse of the interconnected Eastern Mediterranean system that I've outlined throughout this book. In the pages that follow, I will continue to make the case for this disruption. The Late Bronze Age world, as previously described, operated within a system marked by several defining traits. At its core were palatial centers embedded within urban environments. These palaces functioned as the hubs for nearly all facets of life: political, economic, social, and cultural. They held direct control over a large segment of the population through a redistributive economic model. Society was rigidly stratified, with a small elite class reaping the benefits of the broader population's labor. This elite distinguished itself in various ways. They lived in exclusive quarters, amassed considerable wealth, and engaged in a refined, cosmopolitan lifestyle. Another defining aspect of this system was its international scope. The states across the Eastern Mediterranean maintained frequent contact. Though they engaged in warfare, these conflicts were generally conducted within an accepted framework of rules. Meanwhile, their elites competed through displays of prestige and cultural refinement. Diplomatic relationships flourished alongside rivalry, forming a network in which each state was assigned a recognized role and standing. These relations were reinforced through the exchange of luxurious gifts and marriage alliances. At the same time, robust international trade networks thrived, often operating across political boundaries and seemingly unaffected by hostilities. This exchange extended beyond material goods. Cultural and intellectual influences traveled freely among these states, visible in shared artistic styles, literary traditions, and religious beliefs. Such cosmopolitan exchange fostered a sense of shared identity, at least among the elites who recognized themselves as part of a broader, interconnected world. Around 1200 BCE, this intricate system unraveled. its essential structures vanished. Many palaces were destroyed or abandoned, and those that survived were severely diminished. The collapse was particularly evident in the western part of the eastern Mediterranean, the Aegean, Anatolia, and the Levant. In other areas, once dominant powers like Egypt, Assyria, Babylonia, and Elam experienced territorial losses that cut them off from key resources. These setbacks undermined their ability to function as redistributive centers, disrupting the very foundation of their economies. While the elites saw their wealth and influence diminished, the working classes also suffered, as they no longer received the state provisions that had sustained their livelihoods. Perhaps most significant for the elite classes was the collapse of the international network that had long upheld their power. The steady influx of foreign goods and cultural influences came to a halt. With no more diplomatic missions to carry out or wars to wage, the foundation of elite privilege began to erode. In Egypt, for instance, the royal court no longer required scribes trained in Babylonian to draft correspondence, nor could kings arrange marriages with foreign princesses or lead military campaigns abroad. The absence of diplomatic engagement left the remaining states disconnected and uninformed. King Ramesses III of Egypt, for example, inaccurately claimed that Hutti and Carchemish had been destroyed. While he was aware of widespread turmoil, he lacked any nearby allies or partners to provide reliable information. The surviving states felt increasingly isolated, forced to deal with unfamiliar neighbors who did not follow the established rules of diplomacy. In this environment, new powerful figures and groups began to rise. Some may have migrated from outside the region, while others were local populations who had previously held little influence. In the Aegean, for example, warrior chieftains with small retinues quickly amassed wealth, some of which was buried with them in richly furnished tombs. In the Syro-Palestinian region, formerly landless or nomadic communities began settling in villages, cultivating areas that had previously been left untouched. A new class of traders emerged as well, perhaps sailing smaller vessels and dealing in unfamiliar goods like iron tools and weapons. The peoples of the Eastern Mediterranean did not disappear. Many had to adapt, either by merging with emerging societies or by reshaping what remained of their old world to include newcomers. Even those states that weathered the crisis, like Assyria, Babylonia, and Egypt, had to make space for outsiders. Libyan groups settled in Egypt's Nile Delta, and Arameans expanded across Mesopotamia. Across the region, people developed new ways of life, blending old traditions with new realities depending on local circumstances. Some rebuilt societies atop the visible ruins of the past, while others had little left to preserve. But what caused these sweeping changes? There was no singular event or explanation. Some population movements likely brought new groups into the region, and in certain places, internal uprisings against the ruling classes led to destruction. These disruptions, in turn, created space for alternative forms of society to emerge. Climate change, such as prolonged drought, might have contributed by pushing farmers past their limits, though that remains uncertain. Crucially, the seeds of collapse were already embedded in the late Bronze Age system itself. Internally, each state struggled with social inequality that pitted the working majority against the elite minority. Externally, the system was defined by mutual dependence and fierce competition. While these states needed one another to sustain trade and diplomacy, they constantly sought to outmaneuver or weaken each other. This created a fragile balance of power that was always in danger of tipping due to war or shifting alliances. Although the late Bronze Age had provided relative stability for 3 centuries, that stability came at a cost. The very structure that supported the system also made it vulnerable. It relied on continuous interaction and the active participation of all its members. Once the network began to break down, it was beyond repair, and the region had to transition into a new era.